Now we will request Professor Syed Manzoorul Islam to present his keynote speech.
Thank you, distinguished chair, Syed Ghulam Farooq, with whom it has become almost a habit meeting daily. So the other day we spent about 2 hours in the company of school children, and what a delightful experience we had. And based on the performance of the students, we had we could see the very bright future waiting for them. I thank the organizers of the International Conference on Equity and Inclusion in Education, particularly the Secretary General of Asian Center for Inclusive Education in Bangladesh, Dr. Professor Tariq Hassan, for inviting me to present a keynote in this conference. And he also set the topic of my presentation. I wanted to write on inclusivity and other factors, but he says future reforms are important, and when Tariq Hassan requests something from somebody, you just cannot say no. So I had to agree. I'll try to keep to the time, which is 30 minutes. I'll try to be shorter than that so that you have some time left for Q&A. All right? So, educational reforms and the demands of global change. That's the title. Educational reforms and the demands of global change, an overview. The new coronavirus pandemic, which has been raging from the beginning of 2020 and which shows no signs of abating yet, has left a trail of devastation in vital areas of health, economy, and education in almost all countries of the world. It has exposed the vulnerability of the countries in handling disasters of such magnitude and systemic faults in the operation of key contributors to growth and development, including education. The prolonged pandemic has clearly been a disaster. We agree on that. But it has also opened our eyes to the crucial need for introducing reforms in education in line with the changes that are already taking place in many countries of the world. There is a growing realization that without a major shift, and some describe it as a paradigm shift, we cannot expect to make up for the losses we have suffered, upgrade the teaching learning ecosystem to impart best quality education, and prepare our students for the future. Now, if you are following the paper, I am skipping some places because I have to be within time. So you can, and also please don't take it for the final version, still work in progress. I will do some editing, revise some, and then ultimately I'll give to Tariq Hassan whenever he orders so that this is ready for publication. Now, to achieve that paradigm shift, we have to part with the age-old educational practices that are heavily teacher-centered, our present educational practices, heavily teacher-centered, lecture-based, rote learning focused, and dependent on term-ending, high-value, summative tests that alone define learners' merit and capabilities. So I've got a first class, so I'm supposed to be the most brilliant person here. It doesn't mean much. What other capacities do I have, capabilities do I have? Do I have empathy, as Tim Lohrmann was telling us? If I have this empathy deficit in me, my getting A pluses doesn't really mean much. And so this is very important. And so we have to opt for a system which creates knowledge, competence, and skills, discards passive learning in favor of an active, creative, performance-based, and technology-enabled learning that remains a lifelong preoccupation. I wish we had something like Maya, developed by Concordia University, so that children could have really interacted with the robot and got all the answers they wanted. I'm sure this will be happening. And this has to happen if we are to be ready for fourth industrial revolution or whatever it is coming. So this will be a system that addresses all aspects of teaching learning to make it responsive to the 21st century aspirations and challenges. Rethinking our education, which means we have to rethink our education. Rethinking our education to bring about this change will involve a wide range of reforms at all levels of education, some of which may already have begun in a rudimentary form. And I'm happy that Syed Ghulam Farooq is here presiding over this session because he is witness to many of these rudimentary changes. And he has been instrumental in supporting and providing the necessary dynamic forces to these changes. So he might elaborate on these. Now, these reforms will not gather steam if we pursue them in a half-hearted manner or in the usual project-based, slow-moving, or politically expedient ways. We just cannot waste years producing a new educational policy. I am sure you know about this is a game we play with every regime change shows. We produce these educational policies which gather dust or are forgotten completely, so we cannot waste years doing these old exercises. That's what I mean. So we cannot produce a document which just disappears from view when the project ends or a political commitment for its implementation weakens or thrown away after a change of government. To come up with a set of working papers that will define, explain, and justify these reforms at all levels and set a guideline and a timeline for their implementation should not take much time if we are sincere about it. In its ideal form, the reform program should have separate components for each level of education, but should ensure a seamless transition from one level to the next. In my opinion, if we focus closely in the primary and secondary areas of education and carry out the reforms with a determined and sustained effort, the results will stimulate and inspire the next level of reforms, which will probably be ongoing at the same time. This is the main reason, apart from space constraint, why I have highlighted in my paper the reforms in school education, which of course feeds the next level of education. Before I begin to discuss the demands on our education in the context of global change, let me respond to the term global, which has become a contested term in post-colonial theory. Ever since the waves of globalization began to hit our shores, the term has assumed a West-centric bias and application, with disproportionately low representation from the rest of the world. So global doesn't include all of us. That's a problem. Global has indeed subsumed the local, and what is more problematic, defined it from Western perspective. So your local is now defined from Western perspective. We certainly do and will continue to take the best ideas and practices from the West, but we should be wary about losing our own best practices to the over-dominance of the West. We must look at any reform through the lens of our own culture to ensure that the reform ideas do not clash with our own cultural norms and values. Education, after all, is guided by culture, which forms its core values. In my paper, I have shown how reforms in the West can be made to work in our context if we adjust them to local needs and aspirations. Now, the new demands on education, literature on global change and the new demands placed on education seems to be overwhelmingly on the side of a major shift away from traditional practices. I have read quite extensively for the last few days education literature, and I have seen everywhere an emphasis on a shift which is long overdue. what is considered imperative in light of fast-paced advances in technology, remember this, technology changes every few months, artificial intelligence, and I'm happy that Professor Lohrmann has introduced this idea of artificial intelligence and how to respond to it, connectivity, social mobility, and other factors that impact education, is a systematic overhaul of the way we impart our education. Education literature provides a list of reforms that can achieve this overhaul and make it sustainable. The reforms address a broad range of involvement, from strategic planning, pedagogy, curriculum, quality, and technology, to learning environment, and many other areas and issues that constitute the universe of education. A careful look at some key areas reveals how significant the changes and revisions are going to be. I have selected only a few areas where significant changes need to be achieved. For example, in pedagogy, the shift is expected to be towards a student-centered, performance-based approach that will encourage creative and critical thinking among students and will inspire them to take charge of their education. That is what is missing in our present education today. The teacher will act as a facilitator and guide rather than the dominant presence in the class. In curriculum design, a creative, interactive, and innovative approach will see an integration of new knowledge, ideas, innovations, and practices in the context of demands for better delivery. The new curriculum will enable the various stakeholders, such as employers, to provide their input, but it will be prepared and guided by experts and educators with experience of both teaching and curriculum design. In assessment and testing, which is a very contested area, term year-ending summative test will be replaced by continuous class-based evaluation and assessment, much of which will be focused on students' performance in classroom and in co-curricular activities. Assessment will also count tests taken from time to time following a flexible timetable. The aim will be to measure the overall cognitive, critical, and analytical abilities the students have acquired. It will take time to develop the new assessment techniques, and costly as well, and apply them in scale, but this is the direction we must take to bring the students out of the grind of rote learning and reproducing the memorized content in exam scripts without really having an in-depth knowledge of the subjects. Literature and education also emphasize the following. There is further list of things every school education should include, or higher education. Number one is a range of personal skills such as initiative, responsibility, and resilience. These are never taught in our school systems. Social skills such as networking and teamwork. Then an appreciation of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. Now, because this is a seminar which addresses inclusivity, I will not talk on that because you will have sessions devoted to these. A new approach to learner and teacher roles, and then teacher professionalization, then intercultural knowledge and competence, then also entrepreneurial skills, which is in short supply in our country. I taught business students managerial communication at Dhaka University for a long time. Many of them cannot even compete with super managers from India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka or Korea, who are taking all the important jobs in multinational, even national, our own corporations, pharmaceutical industries, in the mobile telephony sector. They are the ones who predominate, and medicine. Why? Because we cannot produce graduates with enough capabilities to compete with them, and they are taking away $6 billion from our country every year. Our expatriate workers earn about $24 billion. 1/4 goes away to other countries because we cannot produce super managers to look after these important corporate sectors. That is not something which says very much about our education. So this has to completely change, and that's what I'm talking about, entrepreneurial skills. And if you combine all these abilities with these entrepreneurial skills, you produce graduates who can take up any responsibility here, elsewhere in the world. And major steps to be taken, transiting from the traditional methods of teaching to the ones responsive to the global changes and new demands put on education, will be difficult and time-consuming. We know that. But it will have to be firmly supported by everyone involved, from the state to the community. For this to happen, certain factors need to be firmly in place. First thing first. Number one is political commitment. For the shift to happen, a strong political commitment will be needed not only from the government of the day, but from all organizations and political parties and all actors across the political spectrum. This will mean that there is a commitment and will to make education number one priority of the nation building efforts, and that all necessary policy support, funding, and continuity of programs are in place so that with the change of government, this will not be cast out. You throw the baby with the bathwater. That's what happens in our country. We need continuity of political support. Second, of course, combining different streams of education into one. We have 3 to 4 existing streams of education in our country: Bangla and English medium, English version, madrasa education, which pursue very different types of education and create mismatch and disparities, weakening the fabric of education. Ideally, there should be one main stream of education, that it happens in most of the countries of the world, one main stream of education, which is accessible to all, and that also availability of education to everyone, irrespective of class, gender, bio, whatever. With provisions for religious education, definitely, for those who want to take it. And that religious education should so modernized that students pursuing madrasa education are not looked down upon as the lowest rung students, as it happens in our country today. And so that one stream education will teach linguistic proficiency. English will be taught along with mother language, and both the language students will have such proficiency that they will not need to go to English medium schools. And mother language is vital. We do not produce graduates who have enough proficiency in even mother language. Forget about English and other languages. Why is it that our people cannot speak in English, cannot speak in Bangla? I'm very surprised that Bangla is now spoken as a mixture of languages: English, Hindi, Arabic. Of course, Bangla has many words from different languages, but you cannot include phrases from other languages inside your own language. Bartholdi syndrome. And we have to devise ways that children from primary schools learn the 2 languages to the extent that they can compete globally in English, and in mother language they can be proud of their own cultural heritage. So funding is another one, and you need a whole lot of funding to support ICT, digital facilities, libraries, laboratories. You need a lot of funding, and ideally, as is suggested by our first educational policy, very visionary educational policy by Kudrat-e-Khuda Commission in 1974, and supported by UNESCO and other organizations working in education. I'm sure your institution also supports this. At least 6 to 7% of GDP or 25% of the budget. Our budget allocation is the lowest in South Asia, near about 2%. So I suggest that you cannot produce high quality education with this shoestring budget. It's not possible. Then teacher recruitment and training. Only talented and qualified teachers can provide quality education. That's a truism which is true in every age. And once they are recruited, they need motivation, they need incentives, they need continuous training. So it's an ongoing process, and I'm sure that once a sufficient number of teachers are trained, they form a critical mass and they can train others. It's like training of trainers. So there will be no dearth of qualified teachers. And remember, teachers should be prepared. They should be subject specialists. They should also be something they will teach all the students. If the teachers are not, for example, socially mobile, if the teachers have problems of diversity, for example, they don't welcome people of physical disabilities in the class, then these cannot be teachers. So teachers must have high benchmark, both in terms of recruitment and in training, and also in monitoring and supervising. These are important things. Then you need community support. Only a caring community can support a school. A caring community is seen to be a bulwark of any school. And we have a tradition of communities supporting schools, for example, from land grabbers, and providing some kind of support system to the schools. But the problem is the school committees are formed by, mostly chaired by, headed by politically appointed persons, some of whom may have criminal records. Nowhere in the world this is allowed, and this should be a shift which is vital. Only educators or people with a stake in education should be appointed there. Retired teachers, for example, educational thinkers, they should be the ones who should chair the school committees, and not some political thugs who have no qualification to even enter the school compound. And then you have educational management. So along with depoliticization of school committees, you also need debureaucratization of education sector. Too much of dependence on bureaucracy, and no participation of civil society, parents, students, groups in any policy decision, let alone implementation. If bureaucrats decide everything, including education, then we cannot really expect to have 21st century education. Full stop. No other argument. And this is based on my experience in several countries where bureaucrats are only facilitators. They do not decide policies. Experts decide policies. Remember, 21st century is a century of experts. And even a child can become an expert if you enable that child. The other day, Farouk and I sat through a presentation in English. And these girls, coming mostly girls, I'm so happy to see that, self-conscious, and then speaking in English, a subject which is just given to them. A girl spoke after getting the subject, after 3 seconds of getting the subject. She just had a look at the subject, started talking. And how dynamic these presentations were. I am amazed to see if this is the level of preparedness a student can have in a school from districts, not even in Dhaka English medium schools. The courage and ability to speak in English in front of an expert group is something that we did not see in many of our teachers even. So imagine we have this critical mass, as I say, we have the materials. We all need to shape them and put them into action, and this is possible. We must have some safeguards we have talked about. One safeguard should be, we must not be too hasty. Haste doesn't bring change. So we must be taking enough time to implement phase by phase all these changes. Secondly, teaching skills should not sideline knowledge. Now there is a debate of skills versus knowledge. These cannot be two separate branches. Knowledge is the ground on which skills are created. Skills should not sideline knowledge. Knowledge should be still the first focus of education. That's the most important thing. Then you should not introduce things too early. For example, critical thinking is something which takes time to develop. It depends on a student's maturity, intellectual ability. You cannot expect a class 3 student to develop critical thinking right away, but slowly expose them to what is called critical thinking, thinking on their own, analyzing, coming to a decision. This thing can take time, so it should not be too early in introducing some reforms. And talking of AI, I am afraid of a future where people will lose human qualities. We should not sacrifice human qualities to artificial intelligence. I mean, you should not believe that algorithm decides your life. Algorithm can complicate your life. But you should have enough human qualities to be empathic. AI is not empathic. AI has to be ordered to be empathic. And who will order an AI to be empathic? The human mind. So the human mind should still be the most precious commodity and something which you value. That's the most important thing. And cultural norms in education. That's something that I always believe will be there. And now I will give you a model that I have prepared. I mean, this is a model I propose, cherish, and see if this is workable. It will need funding. It will need political commitment, definitely. It will need curriculum change. It will need teachers that I have talked about. The new education depends on these changing factors. If these are in place, even rudimentarily, I think this can be done. First of all, transforming the schools. We have primary schools about more than 100,000, 65,000 government primary schools. Imagine turning all these 100,000 schools into centers of excellence. That takes a political will, budget. And then you put these schools into the most beautiful places that you have, like you should have a playing ground. A playground is a vital aspect of a school. So infrastructure development is very important for you. Building new schools, classrooms, transforming classrooms into digital classrooms. You must add auditorium. A school should have an auditorium for cultural programs as well as academic programs. And then you must have a library. How many schools have a library? I cannot imagine a system of education where libraries are discouraged. Children do not have the habit of going to the libraries. I remember in my school, from class 6, we had a small library, but which lent books to us. So we borrowed books every week. And one of our teachers, who taught us Bangla, took presentations on the books. That's how I learned how to talk in front of a group. It took courage for us to face the class, but once we started, there was no stop anywhere. So libraries are vital, laboratories where necessary are vital, enough toilets for girls particularly, canteen for midday meals, a kitchen where midday meals are prepared, supported by the community as well. These things should surround a school system and a residential building where at least 10 flats or 12 flats for primary school teachers. And if you have enough payment given to them, if the pay scale is very attractive, students will not line up the library to read BCS guidebooks, but they will be interested to join teaching first because this will be the most attractive profession. And imagine having all these meritorious students as teachers in primary schools, mostly girls, mind you. The whole education will change. I can guarantee you that. So this infrastructure is important, and then teachers will be centrally recruited. Now teachers recruitment, and I'm sure Farooq can speak volumes on that. Teachers recruitment is a very problematic area. Political interference, party affiliation, these are very important for recruiting teachers. Teachers should be recruited centrally through a competitive system of recruitment, and they should not be pulled under a cadre system. That is terrible. Farooq worked in education cadre. What do you mean by that? You are an educator. You are not a cadre service holder. If you ask me, BCS cadre education is maybe third ranking behind administration, behind foreign service and everything. I mean, they do not have any, like Farooq should have been a secretary or a senior secretary by this time. But he was never considered for a senior secretary. Why? Because our education system is guided not by policymakers who come from education, but by bureaucrats who have no stake in education, except very passing stake. And one in education can go next week to jute ministry and forgetting everything about education and involving himself or herself with jute cultivation. And after 3 months, that person will be transferred to communication. So that person will be forced to read more about bridges and highways. And after 6 months, he will be transferred to disaster management. Education should not be a plaything. There should be serious effort to recruit teachers who are qualified. only the best quality teachers can deliver best quality education. And that is what I mean. And then performance is very important. What I propose is every school, and I have based it on my experience in several countries I have visited, Scandinavian countries, all countries, several times, and I have seen the schools performing. There are schools where you have a club system. So you have nature lovers club, you have education book reading club, you have acting club, you have sports club, at least 10, 14 clubs every school. And every student has to be a member of at least 3 clubs of their choice. And performance in the club constitute 40% of the marks. How? For example, a student who is entering a football club will play the football, but also learn the techniques and rules of football, learn about the great games, watch videos, and how, for example, penalty shootouts take place. What qualities a goalkeeper needs. And then eventually he will have all the practical, theoretical knowledge of football, which he will combine or she will combine with her own performance and make presentations continuously, PowerPoint presentations in the classroom. Somebody goes, a member of the nature club, will visit the forests, for example, or the rivers and write on the visit based on Googling all the related information from the internet and present on her own. If that can be done in English and in Bangla, both languages would be vital. Imagine a child's knowledge. A child will learn new things and take ownership of the knowledge, become a stakeholder in the education, not somebody who passively remembers and passively reproduces, gets an A grade, and you have a V sign showed by the parents, and 5 to 6 tutors giving that child private tuition, and at the end, it's a competition between how much you can remember and how much you can reproduce on the script, then how much you really understand. That transfer is possible through performance. Like a club which is a book reading club, students will take a book to home and then present whatever is on the book in the next week. And all the teaching will be done in the school. No need for tuitions. And at their home in the evening, they will have quality time with their parents, not pouring their eyes on textbooks and memorizing, or jhuke mukhasto kore na. That is a sight which is a terrible sight. As a teacher, I cannot really accept it. And then you have assessment and testing based on these, and you will have exams, but not on fixed time. You will have exams all the year round. And then the students will not feel the pressure, yet they will pass exams, will be graded, and only the most capable ones will get an A+, which will create competition among the others. So this is what I want. And that's lastly, social service, which is very important. Students will be taught communication within society, awareness campaign, for example, polio vaccination, right? If children take charge of the polio vaccination and make awareness in the village, every family will have vaccination. Children can achieve wonders. They are the best ambassadors, let me tell you. And children can also go for tree plantation, many other social services, even helping an old person cross the road. That is one important thing. Not taking drugs. And schools, these students coming from these schools will be so proactive in their lives. They will never need to take drugs. Indeed, books would be their drugs. Knowledge will be their drugs. It is possible in our country. So thank you very much for bearing with me, and thank you for the chair for being very gentle to me.